Thanks, Lori. Today is the fourth and final chapter of a series called Mishearing Message, where we're talking about how the church and Christianity have gotten some basics wrong for a long time. We get too caught up in our culture, and we get confused about what the main thing is. And so we're going to come back to that in a minute. Next week, we're starting a new series that I'm super excited about, and it's called A Prophet Among Us. And we're going to be talking about different prophets throughout the month of February. And we're also going to take moments in each of those services to bring out modern prophets, especially prophets in the civil rights movement, with February being Black History Month. We are not going to let that go. We're not going to let that opportunity slide by without touching on some of those topics. And so our very own Patrick Abubo is going to be sharing the message next week. So he's going to be giving the introduction. What is a prophet, and how does that fit with you and your life today? And he's also going to be sharing the nuggets about modern-day civil rights prophets each week in February, too. So I look forward to hearing Patrick share with us next week. And please join us. Don't miss a beat throughout February. It's going to be awesome. And today we are going to finish that series, Mishearing the Message, talking about how we've misheard the message about church. And that seems really weird to say that the church has misunderstood the church. It's like saying that football players misunderstand football. Like, it's what we do. It's why we got together. That's the whole plan here. How is it that church has misunderstood church? But we can go all the way back to childhood to think about how we get church wrong at a fundamental level from a very early age, right? We all know, here's the church, right? Do it with me now. Interactive sermon. Here's the church. Here's the steeple. Open it up. There's all the people, right? And even kids that have never been to a church and don't know what a church is know that rhyme thing. Like, I don't know what a church is, but this is fun with my fingers, all right? But for those of us who've been around church a while, we understand that the church is not the building. It's the people. Right? This is not the church. This is the church, right? And that's the way the Bible talks about church, uniformly. The church never talks about a building as being the thing we call church. It's never a place. It's always the gathering of people who are followers of Jesus. Acts chapter 8 describes Saul's persecution of the early church, and it says, "But Saul began to destroy the church. Going from house to house, he dragged off both men and women and put them in prison." So going to houses, not to churches, getting the people, because they are the church. When he set out to destroy the church, he doesn't burn down a building where the Christians met. He went to where they lived. Because the church isn't the church without the people. Many of the books in the New Testament are letters written to churches. Romans is written to all the Christians in the city of Rome, right? Okay. Not to the First Presbyterian Church in Rome. 1st and 2nd Corinthians are written to the churches in Corinth. Corinthians live in Corinth, all right? That's a city in Greece. And Philippians was written to Philippi, and Thessalonians was written to Thessalonica, all right? So these aren't random names that people came up with just to make memorizing the books of the Bible harder. That these are actual places that these letters were written to, where actual followers of Jesus were receiving life-giving, vital messages about how they can live a holy and God-honoring life. So letters were written to the followers of Jesus in each of these cities, however and wherever it is that they met. And yet, somehow we have this lingering notion in our culture that church is just a building or just an organization. When you say you're going to have a church wedding, it doesn't mean you're going to invite everybody from the church to your wedding, right? It means you're having a wedding in a particular kind of building that we call a church. And when you ask someone if they're part of a church, you don't say, "Are you a person who is part of a community of followers of Jesus?" That would be a much more precise way of asking that question. Instead, we ask, "Do you go to church?" Right? Do you go to church? So that means you're asking about what they do, for a particular hour of the week and a particular geographical location that they go to at a particular hour of that week. So even though we generally know that the church is the people, we still struggle to understand what exactly we mean by that. And so we default to the easier categories. Church is a building. Church is an institution. Even though it's clearly so much more than that. So today I want to look at what the Bible means when it talks about church. Specifically, I want to look at the book of 1 Peter and the reading that we heard just a moment ago. Traditionally, we believe that the book of 1 Peter was written by the apostle Peter. All right? Yeah, sometimes your intuition, sometimes the right answer at church is not Jesus. All right? This time it's obvious. It's written by Peter, and it was just a few weeks ago I told the story of the conversation between Jesus and Peter when Jesus says, "You are Peter," which means rock, "and on this rock I will build my church." You remember that story when I was talking about conversion? Now Peter, even though he was a follower of Jesus, needed to get converted and again and again, and so do we. Well, keep this in mind as we look to the letter written by this Peter, writing to early followers of Jesus. All right, here's how it starts. He says, "You also are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ." So Peter says to these early Christians, you are the living stones with which God is building the church. A spiritual house. So there it is. The church is to be built of people. We are the house of God in a truer and deeper way than any building could ever be. We are the house of God in a truer and deeper way than any building could ever be. If God lives in any place uniquely in the world, it isn't in a temple or in a sanctuary. It's in the community of people who gather and invite God to be near. If God is anywhere uniquely in the world, like we say that God is everywhere, right? If God is everywhere, but if God is someplace in a special way, it isn't limited by four walls and a roof. And it doesn't matter who holds the title of the building. It has everything to do with the people that have gathered there and the Spirit of God that lives within them as they come together. People talk about going to church to feel closer to God, right? And maybe you have even said that, maybe even this morning. And you're not wrong. But the reason you feel closer to God when you go to church isn't because God lives in this building or any building in a particular way. It's because God lives in us, and when we come together, we stand as the community through whom God is redeeming the world. Peter describes this building built out of Jesus followers like it's a temple too. He says, we are offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God. In the Old Testament, the temple was not only the place where God lived. It was also the place where God-fearing people offered animal sacrifices and crop sacrifices to God. That's how you worshiped God in the Old Testament. That's how it worked. You brought your offering to the temple, and you gave it to the priest who brought your sacrifice before God on your behalf. And Peter says that we are a temple. Like we're a place for offering sacrifices to God. Just quick aside, maybe you've heard people make reference to the scripture, your body is a temple, right? But something that's from 1 Corinthians, and people quote it all the time to say, that's why you should eat more kale, right? Or don't do drugs. But he's not saying you individually, your body is a temple. He's saying your body is a temple, plural. And It's like y'all's body is a temple, all right? And we don't have that word up north here, but it makes perfect sense in the South, all right? It's all of your body. So when you all come together, this is the temple of the Holy Spirit. These people gathered, not you individually. Yes, God lives within you, but when we come together, this is where God lives in a special, unique way in all the world. And Peter agrees. He says, we are like a place for offering sacrifices. We are not only the stones that are used to construct the walls of the building, we are also the priests who make the offering. But we don't offer these sacrifices through the death of animals. We offer it through our own deaths, a death to self, so we can be made alive to God. And you are also the sacrifice made acceptable to God. Because of Jesus, you are the pure, holy sacrifice that God would have expected in the ancient temple. But you don't die when you are sacrificed. You live. You truly live. You live fully and free with the kind of life that only God can give. Free of guilt and shame. Free to live for God and for your neighbor in ways that shine into the darkness of this world. So if you're part of the church, you're not only the very stones from which the building is built, you're also the priest who makes the sacrifice, and your very life is the offering as well. That's how Peter's describing what it is to be the church. And it has everything to do with the people that are gathered there. And here's how this section from Peter closes. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Me too, bud. Me too. I'm a little parched. And now Peter describes not only what the church is, but also why the church exists, to declare the praises of God. When they built the ancient temple in Jerusalem, every detail of the construction was designed to declare the praises of God. The gold that surrounded the interior and the exterior was for God's wealth, that there was nothing that God did not possess. The design filled with symbolism pointing to God's story. The size and grandeur of the temple was designed to inspire awe, just as our God inspires awe within us. And it's true of the great cathedrals, too. Their towering spires pointing heavenward, and their ornate stained glass telling the story of God's love at work in human history through art. And those cathedrals that still stand throughout Europe and much of the world, they're the grand legacy of medieval Christianity in Europe, these churches. Because Europe is just littered with these astounding buildings. If you've taken a trip to Europe, you've probably taken a tour of one of these incredible church buildings. And chances are that no one went to that church for the purpose for which it was constructed. Most of the great cathedrals would sit empty if it wasn't for tourists. That's the reality across. And I'm just going to wonder out loud with you for a while, all right? Imagine the cost involved in constructing one of these astounding buildings, especially in, a pre-modern time where they don't have cranes and lifts. It's actually hard for me to fathom. And imagine the hours upon hours of labor that were involved in putting together such incredible feats of art and architecture. And I just wonder sometimes, I wonder if all that money and all that energy had been invested in caring for the least and the lost and the left out in those communities where those churches went, announcing the love of God throughout Europe in the Middle Ages. I wonder if all that had been poured into the people instead of into a structure, if the legacy of medieval Christianity would be millions of people with a vibrant faith in Jesus working together to make the world a better place instead of a few dusty buildings. I wonder. There have been so many chapters in Christianity when we have forgotten why the church is even here. Too often, we've forgotten that the church does not exist to grasp at political power. The church does not exist to persuade people that we are right. The church does not exist to build great buildings or to put on a great show. The church exists to declare the praises of God throughout the world. And I don't know that the church is done learning this lesson. No, there aren't many cathedrals under construction right now, but there are churches all over the place that are more concerned with their buildings than they are with declaring the praises of God. When you find a church that's really obsessed with its building, you say it's got an edifice complex. Anyway. And I know it's hard to believe, but there are churches not so far from us that had $18 million cash in hand, and they used that to build a brand new state-of-the-art facility while the subsidized apartments and trailer houses around them were just left without thought or care. I don't think it's too difficult. Personally, I don't think that's too different from building a cathedral. Because being the church demands so much more of us than just putting up four walls. We are to offer more to the world than a venue or a concert or a show. And yes, Christians will always need a place to meet. But at some point, enough is probably enough. And each of us will have to make a choice. We'll either be part of the church that is a building or part of the church that is a living thing. A church that is built on spectacle or a church that is built on service. A church that announces how great it is or a church that announces how great God is. So here at Northern Light, we keep those questions in mind all the time. Whenever we have a new idea of something we want to try, we ask, is it honest? Is it personal? And is it faithful? And so that leads us to choose again and again things that don't puff us up and make us look good. They're things that, some other churches would never consider because it's small potatoes. But we know that it's big for us. That's why we serve. That's why we give up taking offering about 4 times a year when we do our serve-in Sundays. We're okay with that. Because it's more important for us to put our hands and feet to work for the good of the kingdom of God. And plus, a bunch of you give electronically anyway. That's a huge part of who we are, is to serve and to care for the people in need around us. And we're going to find ways to constantly embed that in the things that we do and the things that we talk about. Supporting one another is a huge part of the way that we are the church, a way that we declare the praises of God to the world. If you found a friend here who has stood by you in a difficult time, the church is doing its job. They've been the face of God to you in a dark time. And I know that that's true for many of you here. I think we are declaring the praises of God when we celebrate our kids, when we involve them in worship, when we bring them up front, when they become part of the baptisms. Some churches don't let kids in the sanctuary. And we celebrate it. When our kids make noise and cry, it announces to us that this is an okay place for all of us to cry. When we hear a child's voice, we are reminded that we are all children of God. And it's something that we can celebrate together. So that's why we invite those sounds. And we announce the praises of God through sacrifice, through giving financially, but even more important, giving our hearts to one another, coming with our true selves and offering that to God. That's what this whole deal is about. That's the kind of church. That kind of church doesn't start with a Gothic sanctuary or an elaborate production. It starts with honest, faithful worship and sacrifice. And so when you invite someone to church, you aren't just inviting them to experience an event. It isn't about what happens on Sunday and then the other 167 hours of the week are inconsequential. When you invite someone to church, you're saying, this is what I'm about. These are my people. This is how I believe God will change the world. And that's what I believe about you. You are the church. No, we don't have a vaulted ceiling, no stained glass, no flying buttresses, no fog machines, no American Idol finalists leading the music. It's just us. A few dozen people who believe that God is up to something here at Northern Light. No, we aren't perfect. We aren't for everyone. But Northern Light is for anyone. We aren't for everyone, but we are for anyone. Anyone who's asking questions, anyone who's looking for more, anyone who is in search of church. Not a church based on buildings or budgets, but a church based on declaring the praises of God to everyone, everywhere, in every way that we can. Pray with me. God, we come to you as your children. But not only your children, we are your raw materials. And through our lives, you are building something beautiful here in Ramsey. And we ask that you would knit our lives together, that you would be the mortar that cements us one to another so we can build something that changes the landscape of this town. Maybe the skyline will look the same, but the impact of your love that sings out these doors would be revolutionary. Be near to us this morning, God. Help us to experience your embrace in this place so that we can offer it freely to this world. Amen.